House Oversight Committee, led by a new MAGA majority, gathered for the first time today and held an organizational meeting to establish the committee's rules. About an hour into the meeting, freshman Democrat Jasmine Crockett of Texas introduced an amendment to reestablish the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Subcommittee that the previous majority had. And she referenced the brutal beating death of Tyre Nichols as an example of why the subcommittee is so necessary. That was enough to trigger one of Kevin McCarthy's newest allies to bring up what she sees as among the most pressing civil rights issues facing Americans.
I do agree with you about Tyre Nichols' death. I watched the video, and it was tragic and extremely difficult to watch. I would also like to point out that that city is Democrat-controlled, and the 5 officers that have been arrested and charged are Black. And I think that this isn't an issue of racism or anything like that. I think that the judge and the jury and the trial needs to work out what happened there. But I share that with you. But I'd like to also point something that I'd hope you share with me. There's a woman in this room whose daughter was murdered on January 6th, Ashley Babbitt. And Ashley Babbitt there's never been a trial. As a matter of fact, no one has cared about the person that shot and killed her. And no one in this Congress has really addressed that issue. January 6th committee didn't address it. And I believe that there are many people that came into the Capitol on January 6th whose civil rights and liberties are being violated heavily.
All right, there, just a taste of what is to come in the new Republican-led House. Congresswoman Katie Porter is a Democrat of California who serves on the Oversight Committee alongside Marjorie Taylor Greene. She recently announced she will run for the Senate seat currently held by Dianne Feinstein. Congresswoman Porter, I guess the first question is, what changes now in your job on oversight? How is it different being on the minority as opposed to the majority?
Well, oversight itself isn't a partisan game. It's about making sure that we're closing the gap between what the law says it does and what it actually does in people's lives. So from that perspective, the fundamental project is the same. Are the laws that we're passing being applied in a way that's actually making a difference? Are we protecting Americans, all Americans, from waste, fraud, and abuse? So I think that, kind of thinking about this as a partisan thing actually weakens the larger project of oversight, which is to deliver good governance for all. But
when you don't have the gavel, right, you don't get to control the areas of inquiry, which, of course, is why, the majority likes to take the gavel, and they will determine what the subject of certain committees are and what witnesses are going to call. And I guess the question is, when you don't have the control over the agenda setting, well, then what do you do as a committee member?
Well, look, sometimes the Republicans are going to find problems that I think both sides should be concerned about. That's exactly what's happening tomorrow at our first oversight hearing, which is about the fraud in the pandemic unemployment program. That hurt all of us as taxpayers, and as someone who personally supports making sure that people who are out of work get help. Having that money stolen by fraudsters hurts everybody. It weakens our unemployment program. It hurts us all as taxpayers. So I do have questions about what we need to do to strengthen and prevent fraud in that program. But where the Republicans are falling down is they're attempting to paint this as a failure of President Biden, when in fact, the facts and data are very clear. Our unemployment insurance programs have been at risk of fraud for over 20 years. They've had fraud problems under Republican presidents, including President Trump, under Democratic presidents in blue states, in red states. This is a structural, systematic problem. The Republicans are going to give me a chance to talk about that tomorrow and talk about how to prevent fraud and protect taxpayers. That's a chance I'm going to take.
I want to play for you something that one of your colleagues, Matt Gaetz, said to my colleague Ari Melber last night about the sort of deal that was struck between Kevin McCarthy ultimately that allowed him to become Speaker after that seemingly interminable week of multiple votes, and confirming that there was a deal, essentially a secret deal, some of it written down, some of it seen by some folks. Take a listen.
Point blank, Congressman, have you or your staff seen this additional agreement in writing in any form?
Yeah, it took multiple forms. There was specifically a side-by-side sheet where we made offers to McCarthy. There were some offers he accepted, some he modified, some he rejected, just like you'd see in any negotiation.
Why not commit to releasing the written agreement or working to get it released tonight?
Yeah, I have no objection to that, but it was largely released to the conference and to the country when you saw the appointments of the committees.
How much power do you think that caucus holds right now in the U.S. Congress?
Well, to the extent that they're not working for the American people, but are instead playing partisan political games, which is part of what we saw, unfortunately, today in oversight, I think the answer is too much. I think all of our committees and all Americans in every part and pocket of this country deserve serious legislators who are going to work to address the problems facing Americans. And that means taking on real challenges. That means holding bad guys accountable and not just pushing partisan talking points. I'm concerned about some of the committee appointments we've seen where we have representatives who I think are going to be more concerned about hijacking democracy than they are about defending it.
We are expecting, I believe, tomorrow a Fed announcement on possible increasing interest rates. There's wide expectations there will be another hike. There is a lot of data suggesting that inflation has slowed down and that they have basically done their job and should take yes for an answer. And there's a bunch of politicians, mostly Democrats, but not exclusively, who have been saying the same thing. How concerned are you about the Fed's actions and what the impact will be on the folks you represent?
Well, at the start, let me be clear. I support the Fed being completely free from political interference. But as a single mom who's trying to feed 3 very hungry kids, I will tell you that inflation is a real concern. I feel it every time I fill up my minivan with gas or go to the grocery store to buy endless boxes of Cinnamon Toast Crunch or whatever cereal my kids want. But I do think that this technique that the Fed is using of raising the rate in order to deter people from spending misses a real fact about our economy, which is that the vast majority of Americans don't have any extra money to save instead of spend, which is the whole theory behind raising the interest rate, is to encourage people to save their money rather than spend it. Most Americans are spending every dollar they have because that's what it takes to put food on the table, to get quality health care, to pay for prescription drugs, to keep a roof over their heads. So I think the risk here is of hurting everyday Americans who might be pushed out of work if we go too far and tip the economy into a recession.
Final question for you is about COVID oversight. This strikes me as an area where, again, the agenda will be set, I think, with a very clear partisan view about, the evil Dr. Fauci who malevolently led Americans into a kind of pandemic tyranny. But it also strikes me as an area where there's a lot to actually do oversight on. And what are your thoughts about what you expect from the committee's work on that?
What I hope to see from the Oversight Committee, what I think Americans deserve to see, is us looking at what can we learn from the experience of this pandemic and the government's response to it to prepare us for what might come next. The pandemic is not the first recession I've lived through, and I sadly fear it will not be the last. So what can we learn, for example, about how to prevent fraud in unemployment systems so that when we have to strengthen them, we're not at risk? What can we learn about preparing for public health emergencies so that we're ready should we face another one, whether it comes from national security or other causes? So I hope that the goal here is to be forward-looking and prescriptive, learning and thinking about what we can do better next time, rather than simply attempting to point fingers and put blame on things in the past.